Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mark Huxley, and I'm going to be navigating us through today's Knowledge Miles 695th Lord Mayor's lecture. Today's subject, a very serious one, humanitarian surgery in Gaza, 14 years in war and peace. We're going to be exploring the work of Ideals and its approaching 25 years mission to relieve poverty, distress and suffering in any part of the world affected by conflict and or natural disaster. Not short term, but with long-term commitment. Ideals has been working in Gaza since 2009, with its limb reconstruction project starting in 2013. So we're going to learn about the work they've been doing there today, challenges and the impacts of the present war, and hopes, hopefully positive hopes for the future. Should warn some of the content with the topic may be difficult, make for difficult listening and or viewing, so just be aware of that. So a very quick rundown how today's going to work. I'm going to properly introduce our speakers, Sarah Phillips and Victoria Rosie, in a moment, after which they're going to speak for about 20 minutes, and that will give us lots of time for questions. In asking questions, if you look to the top right-hand side of your screen, you'll see there's a call-out box with a question mark in it. Please put the questions in there. Please do not put them in the chat. Don't put your hand up or anything else, because we'll miss them. So just please use that one box and just keep posting questions in, and I'll work through them as diligently as I can. We often get lots and lots of questions, and if we can't get through all of them, they will be shared with Sarah and Rosie afterwards, so they can follow up and respond to you directly. As you'll know, the session's being recorded, and we have a dedicated YouTube channel on which they're all going to sit. So that's enough of the parish notices. Now just to welcome Sarah and Rosie, both. Thank you for joining us today. A quick bio. Sarah Phillips is an orthopaedic surgeon with an interest in limb reconstruction. She was appointed as a consultant at King's College Hospital in 1998, served in the Army Reserve for over 30 years, retiring in 2021, and was deployed in March 2003 during the Second Gulf War. She's a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Barbers, who are hosting today's lecture. So thank you, Barbers, for supporting the project. And Sarah's been in there since 2014. She serves on their charity committee and is also a trustee of two other charities, Ideals and Rebuild. Sarah's been involved in helping establish a limb reconstruction service in Gaza since 2013. Ideals has provided training for orthopaedic surgeons, nurses and physiotherapists, as well as providing specialist orthopaedic equipment. Charities help in treatment of war-wounded patients and those injured in the 28-29 border demonstrations. She's recently, I believe, returned from missions to Gaza. Victoria Rosie is a British-trained, fully accredited consultant plastic surgeon working both at St Thomas's and King's College Hospital. She's on the General Medical Council Specialist Register for Plastic Surgery and is a member of the British Association of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgeons. Her main area of expertise is complex microsurgical reconstruction. Been an NHS consultant since 2007, worked initially in Manchester at the Nightingale Centre at the Wythenshawe Hospital, heading up the breast reconstruction service for one of the largest breast cancer units in the country. In April 2013, moved back to London to take the post of lead for plastic surgery trauma reconstruction at King's College. Her main areas of interest are microsurgical breast reconstruction, complex breast reconstruction, and lower limb trauma reconstruction. Actively involved in plastic surgery training, has represented both the London and North West deaneries, currently chair of the Specialist Advisory Committee for the Joint Committee of Surgical Training, holds a PG certificate in medical education and obtained a medical law degree at Cardiff University in 2018, and is an honorary lecturer at King's College London and a faculty of life science and medicine. That is more than enough of my voice, so I'm going to pass over to Sarah, Rosie. Look forward to your seminar, and I'll see you in about 20 minutes for the Q&A.
Thank you. So thank you for the invitation to talk to you today. This is going to be a little bit difficult because we've got no control of the slide, so it might come across as a little bit disjointed. So next slide, please. So no conflicts of interest as far as I'm aware. but we have received support from various different organisations and NGOs, including DFID. As Marcus said, you may find some of the slides quite graphic, and we'll try to warn you, but please realise that Rosie and I, having done complex trauma and been in war zones, not that we're immune to it, but we're not always upset by things that others might be upset by. I make no apologies for it. The wounds that you will see need to be seen to see what happens during war. Next slide, please. So background, press, because there should be a map coming up. So there's been a blockade since 2007, basically land, sea and air. The only ways in are through Erez and Kerem Shalom, which are in Israel, and Rafah on the Egyptian side. Next slide, please. The population was 2.3 million. It is one of the most densely populated countries, strip of land in the world. 75% refugees, pre-October 23, 70% below the poverty line, and 47% unemployed. Next slide. And next slide. Despite that, the Palestinians are a very resilient people, very hospitable, very caring, certainly to us and all the visits that we have made. And despite the harshness of their life, there is was a good community. I wouldn't say flourishing, because in the circumstances and economic circumstances it can't. Next slide, please. We know that in any country that has limited money, I hesitate to call Gaza a low to middle income country because they would disagree. There's always an increase in trauma. But in Gaza especially, there is a cycle of violence, which means that there have been ongoing conflict since 2008. Next slide, please. So we've had various different incursions or wars. Pre-2023, the longest was in 2014, which was a 51-day war. And these photos are actually taken from them. The top photo is actually of a hospital. This is Al Wafa. This is the rehabilitation hospital that had been decommissioned in a very permanent way. Next slide. But the cycle continues, but something different. So in 2018 to 19, you had the Great March of Return protests. These were community social protests at the border. And depending on which side of the border you are, it depends on what it's looking at. If you're the Gazan side, it's the Nakba, the catastrophe. If you're the Israeli side, it's the 75-year anniversary of the formation of Israel. And these border protests created a lot of injuries. Next slide. All of them were gunshot wounds to the limbs, over 6,500, and between 1,200 to 1,500 required complex limb reconstruction surgery. Next slide, please. And the trauma cycle continues, May 21, August 22, May 23, varying numbers of killed, varying numbers injured. Next slide. Prior to October 23, it is quoted that there are 36 hospitals within Gaza. But if you look at that more closely, it's not quite what it seems. They're not full hospitals. Only 13 of them are MOH, and only 4 actually have full emergency services, so accident emergency, acute medicine, acute surgery, etc. So there's actually only 4 what we would call proper hospitals. They had a well-established Palestinian medical board and training program, have a very capable workforce, and they had a medical school. But because of the blockade, there are problems, limited supplies, often zero stock, limited budgets, and they were always reliant on having to transfer more complex patients out of Gaza, either to the West Bank or East Jerusalem, or to Egypt or Turkey. Next slide, please. So the challenges: 17 years of intermittent conflict, which is obviously ongoing. The difficulties of a healthcare where there is a blockade, so general maintenance, electricity and water can be in short supply. Staff aren't always paid. Lack of medical supplies, no orthopedic budget. And then capacity during a surge is limited, even pre-October, and they're unable to transfer casualties out. This training is in isolation, whereas previously Gazan surgeons or medics would be able to come abroad, including to the UK, for training. It was very difficult for that to carry on. Completely reliant on humanitarian aid and donations. And as you can see, there always has been a significant amount of trauma. Next slide. So, injuries seen in conflict. This is one of the milder ones. This is a gunshot wound. But you can see blast, fragment, burn, crush, gunshot as this one, and then inhalation. Every conflict has a different pattern of injuries, but most conflicts will have limb injuries in 70 to 80% of patients. Next slide. So when you're dealing with these injuries, you have to decide whether they're salvageable or not only surgically, so whether you can reconstruct by whatever means, or whether they need an amputation. But what you need to also consider when you're working in somewhere like Gaza or in time of war, what may also decide what your strategy is for treatment is the number of casualties, the time that you have to deal with them, the facilities, whether there's going to be ongoing care, and actually the cost. We don't necessarily think of that even in our major incidents in the UK, but all this has to be taken into consideration, because as you will see, and I'll explain, limb reconstruction is difficult, takes time, and is costly. Next slide, please. So what is limb reconstruction? Next slide. So we're going to have a quick fire of a few pictures. So non-union, fractures that don't unite. Next slide. Bent legs. Next slide. One leg longer than the other. Next slide. Bits missing, bone loss. Next slide. Infection. Next slide. Soft tissue loss that might require a bit of tissue taken from elsewhere. Next slide, please. When it comes to limb reconstruction, one of the mainstays of treatment is what's the Zaros method. We can make bone. It's like the medieval rack. You put a fixator on someone and you stretch them at 1 millimeter a day. Next slide. So this chap who's got 5 to 6 centimeters of missing bone after a road traffic accident has his ordinary X-fix. Next slide. Gets his circular frame, got the gap. Next slide. And then we move the bone through the leg. Next slide. Until you get the two ends joining. And in the space at the top, you get bone forming. Next slide. And you end up with a straight leg, which is all healed. The trouble is you can only move the bone at most 1 millimeter a day. And this whole cycle of treatment takes a minimum of 18 months. So difficult. Soft tissue reconstruction, which Rosie might go into more. Next slide. Either local flap, so rotating bits of tissue round. Next slide. Or free flaps, taking a whole bit of tissue with vein and artery and plugging it in elsewhere. This takes not only equipment, but a lot of expertise and time, but also the post-operative care. New slide, please. So limb reconstruction is a challenge because it's arduous and lengthy, it's inpatient and clinic heavy. You need lots of people to help you. It's not just about the surgeons, and it's expensive, and it requires a stable environment, something that we don't often have in Gaza. And at King's, we actually have to have our own charity to help us. Next slide. So ideals. Ideals stands for International Disaster and Emergency Aid with Long-Term Support. It was set up in the early 1990s by John Beavis, a retired orthopaedic surgeon who retired from the NHS on medical grounds when his coronary artery bypass failed. Interestingly, it only failed when he went to management meetings. It was fine when he was operating and things like that. Next slide. The difference between us and a lot of other charities is the long-term support. It's not fire and forget. One of our projects was actually in Sri Lanka after the tsunami, and we bought a boat for a village, a fishing boat. Much better to buy a fishing boat than to buy them the fish. Next slide, please. We've been involved in Gaza and the West Bank since 2009, but with the limb reconstruction since 2013. Number of different organisations. Next slide. 5 phases. Basically, our objectives were training, teaching, treating, provision of equipment, and capacity building. And it's the capacity building that's important. And our first project was to bring 3 Gazan orthopaedic surgeons in turn to King's to spend time with us to see what limb reconstruction and multidisciplinary team working was about. Adnan, who's on the far right of this picture, was our first. We had hoped that we would continue the project, but have a sort of help to build a hub and spoke type of service so that you had a central limb reconstruction unit or area of expertise and improve the trauma of the other hospitals. Next slide. So in 10 years, we actually did achieve that. We established a Gazan limb reconstruction service that was based at the Nasser Hospital. Over 2,500 consultations, 630 operations. I was a quartermaster. I've spent $3 million on orthopedic equipment. But the main things is that we've actually managed to train surgeons who can deal with these patients without us. We've achieved more than we've done in the UK. In Gaza, limb reconstruction became a mandatory specialty that all orthopedic trainees had to go through. We don't even have that in the UK. But most important of all, we had enduring relationships with Palestinian colleagues. Next slide.
So I'm just going to take over and talk about the present situation since the 7th of October. So this is the up-to-date OCHA data from the 8th of October, which states that 41,965 Palestinians have been killed and 97,590 have been injured. But this doesn't include the people that are under the rubble who are unknown, and anyone that's died at home and their relatives haven't reported it to a local hospital. Next slide. The main thing to look at is the number of people that have been displaced since the war started. So within the first 10 days of the war, more than 1 million people were displaced. We are now at a year, and it's estimated that 90% of the population have been displaced at least once. Next slide. There's also, next slide. There's also been a disconnect between the north and south of Gaza. The Netzarim corridor has been built, and you are now not allowed to travel from the south into the north, and there is a huge push to remove any remaining Palestinians from the north. Sarah has already mentioned that we keep hearing that there's 36 hospitals in Gaza, and OCHA are stating at the moment that 17 of them are partially operational. If you could go through the next 4 clicks, you'll see the 4 hospitals. The first was Shifa, which has been completely decommissioned now. The next biggest is Nasser, which is still working. Then the European Gaza, which has been evacuated but is on its way back to functioning. And the last one remaining, if you click now, is Al-Aqsa, which again has just been evacuated. Next slide. I mean, the main things to say are that since the war started, there have been minimal convoys through the Kerem Shalom border. In fact, when both Sarah and I travelled at the beginning of this year, there were over 1,500 trucks waiting at Al Irish to get in. Waiting at Rafah. Well, they were in. Waiting at Rafah to get in. So there's a severe water and food shortage. 60% of the water and sewage facilities have been destroyed, and there's also been a huge spike in communicable diseases. Obviously, we're aware of the polio crisis that's hit. This is aerial data showing the damage that's been done in Gaza from October until September, and you can see it starting in the north and spreading. Basically, most of the population has now been pushed into a very small area in southern Gaza, just in the south. And you can play this video. This just shows you sort of what the humanitarian zone is like at present. So in the background, you can see a sea of tents stretching from the road towards the ocean. So the present situation is that Ideals has managed to achieve emergency medical team status with the aim to get back into Gaza to provide needed equipment and support to our Palestinian colleagues. And we achieved this shortly after the war started, and the first mission went back in December. All access is being coordinated by the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And since the Rafah border closed in May, it's been coordinated by the government activity of the territories, which is an Israeli administration. So the first 4 missions went via Cairo, and we left from Heathrow, landed in Cairo, and then travelled across the Sinai Desert to the Rafah crossing. We were very lucky initially in that we managed to get baggage waivers from BA, and we were able to take quite a number of suitcases with us. So on the mission that I went, we took 25 suitcases full of medical equipment that had been donated and the rest that the charity had bought. We had hired our own minibus and driver, and we joined about 19 other minibuses and drove across the Sinai towards the Rafah crossing, and there's footage here of all of the aid trucks that we were discussing. Once we got across the Rafah border, we had our own driver, we transferred all our cases into his cars, and then we travelled along the Saladin Road to the European Gaza Hospital, and that's where we decanted, and we lived and worked there for the duration of the mission. And the footage here of the Saladin Road is quite important, as it appears in the video that was taken 4 months later. This is just some footage of Graham and I when we arrived at the European Gaza Hospital, walking down the stairs to deliver some of the equipment in theatres. And if you click again, you'll see what it used to look like. So you can see that the entire hospital had sort of become almost like a refugee camp, with people congregating in the corridors. If you keep playing the video, you'll see that as we come down the stairs from theatre, there are families living behind bed sheets in the corridor. And it made it very difficult to sort of not only navigate the hospital, but also to get any work done, as people continually came up to you and asked you for medical support. By the time that the Rafah border closed in May, the only entrance through was Kerem Shalom, and this border was controlled by Kogat. This time we were only allowed to take 1 suitcase each that weighed 23 kilograms, and we weren't allowed to take any medical equipment with it. So most of my packing consisted of food and water. I took some clothing for the family of workers, that Palestinian colleagues that I already knew, but mainly it was clothes and food. I managed to take in a few personal items of equipment. So I took in my operating glasses, and I took in a small tray that I was given by one of our theatre sisters so that I could carry out some plastic surgery. This time the crossing was from Jordan, and we crossed into the West Bank, and then from the West Bank we were on a bus, and this bus only took 25 people in on a Tuesday and 25 people in on a Thursday. Graham and I were the only two surgeons on the bus during our trip. The rest of the passengers were made up of WHO workers and UN workers. So on our trip, we had people like bomb disposal experts. We had a PhD student that was tracking the polio virus, and lots of NGO administration staff. The convoy went down to Kerem Shalom with a police escort, and then we were decanted into UN armoured vehicles, and we crossed into Gaza again using the Saladin Road. I don't know if you can see the footage of the change between the two areas. So the typical injuries that we were seeing were soft tissue amputations, next slide, traumatic amputations, next slide, burns, and also gunshot wounds and quadcopter wounds. A quadcopter is a drone that has firepower capability. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And if you just flick through these pictures, I think there's 3 clicks. So typically open injuries where there's both bone and soft tissue loss. Next slide. And probably the most striking thing that we saw, there was a huge amount of trauma in very young children. And this is just a selection of children that I saw on the March trip that had all been injured in a blast injury when masonry is sort of whipped up in the force of the blast and hits them at quite a speed, causing penetrating injuries to, as you can see, the face, the head, the limbs. Next slide. The other thing that we saw in quite abundance, and if you can play the video that's in there, was infection. There's a video in that, yeah. Infection obviously is due to the nature of the injuries and that the blasts are outside and a lot of external dirt is taken into the wound, but also due to the delay in actually managing to treat these patients. Because of the numbers of patients that are coming in, you are not able to get someone to theatre as quickly as we would in the UK. Compounding this is the malnutrition rates, and also that there is a previously high antibiotic resistance coupled with poorly supplied theatres. And there's a video in the bottom of the next slide, that little boy, if you click on that. On top of this, we were continually seeing non-acute trauma patients. So this little boy here was hit in the December and was presented to me in March after he'd sustained his burn injury. And you can see that he can't quite extend his arm because the skin graft is stopping him, and his mother was quite distraught that I wouldn't bring him into hospital to do a release, which is exactly what I would do in the UK. And then if you click on the little baby above, there's a video there. The other thing that we were seeing in abundance were congenital problems, such as this little girl who suffered a cleft lip and palate deformity. And obviously that was not something that I was able to admit and address during the visit. And then the little boy in the bottom right-hand corner has got a hemangioma, which is a perfectly benign lesion, but if you're not a doctor, you wouldn't know that, and they grow quite rapidly and can be quite distressful for the parents, but there is no facility for us to see these sorts of injuries. If you go on to the next slide and play the video, all of this is conducted amidst the background of non-stop warfare.
It's Tuesday, 2nd of April and the drones are back.
Yeah, look at that. Can you see it? Rising in the... That does look close now. I don't know whether you can see that, but that was just a land strike. You can just see the spike, the smoke.
Surgeons.
Rising in the... That does look close now.
That sounds quite close, doesn't it?
I don't know whether you can see that, but that was just a land strike. You can just see the spike, the smoke.
Surgeons.
That's
That sounds quite close, doesn't it?
So despite all of this, the mission activity was very successful. We managed to deliver 40 suitcases of equipment to the European Gaza Hospital. We had over 604 consultations. We performed 502 procedures, 23 nerve blocks, and we managed to deliver £80,000 worth of donated equipment and £90,000 worth of purchased equipment by the charity. But the main thing that we have provided is support to our Palestinian colleagues. Next slide, please.
Next slide.
Next slide. So there still is quite a huge challenge
Next slide.
in the number of patients that there are to treat. Have not stopped coming, and with the constant closures of the hospitals, the ones that are open are absolutely swamped. We're now looking at a lack of basic medical supplies due to the lack of equipment that's being able to get across the border at Kerem Shalom, and also a lack of appropriate staff to look after them, as the restrictions on who can enter have really increased. So doctors can now only enter Gaza if they deploy for a minimum of a month, and no one with any Palestinian heritage is allowed to go. And for us at Ideals, that drastically reduced the number of volunteers that were eligible.
So the future, well, who knows? This is Deir al-Bala, which is a Commonwealth War Cemetery. It was a beautiful place, and obviously they're buried there, Commonwealth and British soldiers from the First World War. Next slide. We hope that we'll be going back to Gaza, but we've also been invited to Lebanon, and you never know, we might end up in the West Bank as well. Next slide. So what have we learned? Well, it takes time and perseverance to build a practice or build a service, but it's also about building trust with partners, and it's about collaboration, not competition. But ultimately, everything is fragile. I think the other thing I've learned is that we don't learn from history. In American Civil War, General Sherman is quoted as saying, "Only those who have never fired a shot nor heard the shrieks and groans of the wounded cry aloud for more blood, more vengeance, more whatever. War is hell." And it is. Next slide, please. Lots of acknowledgements, probably far too many to say. We have had support from industry. Next slide, please. This would not have happened without John, who founded Ideals, and also Graham Groom, who's past master of the inn holders, those who might recognise him. This would not have happened without both these people, who've devoted a large part of their lives to this. Next slide. And finally, Adnan Dalbersh, who was our first fellow, became the head of orthopedics at Shifa. He was arrested in December 23 and died in Israeli detention in April 24. It is not known the reason for his death, but he was young and fit. Abdulrahman Halmadja was a medical student that both Rosie and I came across this year. It was amazing, working well above what our medical students would be able to do. and he died in a missile attack in August while Rosie was in Gaza. Thank you. That's it.
Oh, no, thank you, ladies. I'm just trying to find the right first words, and I'm not sure I can quite find them. So we're stark. That's the only word that's going through my head at the moment. Wow. So we got some questions. There's a couple of them around the kind of scale of what's going on at the moment. Someone asks, have you seen anything else of this awful scale in terms of civilian deaths in recent history?
No, and I don't think there has been. If you look at Ukraine, there's been more tonnage of bombs dropped on Gaza than there was in the whole of the 2 to 3 years how long Ukraine's been going on. If you look at the Northern Ireland troubles, 40 years, there was only 4,500 deaths, I think, in total. You're talking about over 5% of the Gazan population is either injured, dead, or under the rubble. So no, I don't think there has been.
I mean, from what it was to what it is today, you can't really put a number over it. But I mean, how much has it deteriorated out there? And how much more deterioration can there actually be? I mean, is it really hit the apocalyptic state now? I mean, the stuff we see on the TV news is obviously one lens of it, but you've seen it in reality. How much worse can it get?
I think that's the difficult thing about the conflict, is that lots of people assumed that Gaza was just a refugee camp of rubble before we started. But actually, our colleagues who have lost their homes have lost sort of 3-story villas, and, some of them had 2 cars. So there was quite a functioning society in Gaza and quite a lot of infrastructure. It's estimated now that over 75% of the structures have been flattened. So I suppose the answer to that is the Israelis have got 25% left to do.
And what one assumes the relationship with the Israelis is challenging, should we say, on a daily basis. And I'm guessing that's your biggest blocker to humanitarian aid, is just being allowed. You talked about being able to move across the strip. Sorry, Victoria.
We don't do politics, but obviously the Israelis control what goes in and out of Gaza, because you can only get in through Kerem Shalom, and undoubtedly sort of food aid is difficult to get in. Commercial food is now getting in, but unfortunately the Gazans can't afford it.
But the other thing that they've restricted recently when I was there in August is all sort of shampoos, soaps, toothpaste. None of that has got through. So no hygiene items had got into Gaza for over a month when I was there in August. So the prices of things like shampoo was incredible, and there was just people were making their own soap. There was no soap. So that it does make you wonder how these items can be specifically stopped. And also the fact that we were limited in what we could take to one suitcase, specifically so that we couldn't bring any medical equipment, but also we were warned by the United Nations that we could only take one phone, one laptop. So there will seem to be a blockage on you taking items for your colleagues as well. Obviously, I was asked to take multiple phones, multiple leads and chargers for people, shoes for children. And it was all of those high-end items that they searched the bags for.
I'm not sure a pair of shoes is a high-end item.
Well, no, the shoes got through.
There's a very specific question in here, which I'll read verbatim. As you explained, there had been successful limb reconstruction established in Gaza for a number of years, but that has become almost impossible. This means there are thousands of adult and child amputees. So the Scottish Palestinian Health Partnership are reaching out to the National Prosthetic Centre at Strathclyde University. Are you working with any projects to help deal with the amputees that have resulted from the current appalling conflict?
Not at the present time. We're still very much focused on the acute work because that's all you can do at the moment. There's one of the difficulties in the past was that yes, you could do the limb reconstruction. Amputation is not is culturally relatively unacceptable in Gaza and a lot of Muslim countries.
Although it probably will be more acceptable now.
Yeah, but there was actually a limb. There was a prosthetic service in Gaza pre this last war, which was partly run by ICRC. The difficulty of patients going outside to get prosthesis is that they may get state of the art, but unless that's possible to be serviced within Gaza, it doesn't last for very long. And that's definitely true for the children, because obviously if they're growing, then they need a change of prosthesis relatively often. So we would be happy to work with anyone, but at the present time, until there is a ceasefire and some stability, reconstruction has to wait on the whole. We can only do with the acute stuff.
Okay. I'm just conscious we're going to run down in time, but I just want to give you a bit of an opportunity to talk a bit more generally about Ideals, not just what it's doing in Gaza, but wherever else it may be operating. And there's a classic closer question that someone's put up there. What's the key takeaway message? You got that very strong, powerful last slide, but if there's that one thing about Ideals, how can we help you? What more can be done?
Pressurize. I said I wasn't going to be political, but we have to pressurize governments that there needs to be a ceasefire. Until there's a ceasefire, it's very difficult for the humanitarians to do their work, or certainly those who are providing medical care and reconstruction of limbs and lives. Ideals, we're a tiny charity. We're all volunteers. I don't think we have anyone we pay. So all, I think 90% of any funds goes into either paying for the trips or paying for equipment. We used to work until recently, we were actually working in Lebanon, and we were running a primary health care service, mobile service for Syrian refugees, and working with another partner there. Because we're so small, we can really only concentrate on one sort of project at the time. We had thought last year, before October, that actually the Gazan project might have been finishing in the next year or so, and we were setting our sights on going somewhere else, but obviously that's not going to happen.
Rosie, have you a closing comment or two from you?
I think, we are looking at other ways in which we can work now. So we're trying. Ideals is looking at sending some volunteers to Turkey to help with the patients that have been evacuated from Lebanon and Gaza. But yeah, our main issue is we can't get our volunteers into Gaza because of the restrictions. So the best thing that you could do is lobby for a ceasefire.
Okay, no, thank you. I think it's a perfectly powerful message to end on. Just a couple of parish notices before we properly close out of the upcoming lectures. I will put a very personal shout out for the last one because in my world, the Lloyd's insurance market and the Lloyd's lab is where I live, so I'm very much looking forward to particularly chairing that one. Really, just thank yous. I think I'm going to speak on behalf of everybody in here to say the hugest thank you to the two of you and the rest of the Ideals team and everybody else that is doing what you're doing. Magnificent. So please keep up the good work. I'm sure we're going to put lots of links in the show notes to Ideals and other related charities to give whatever tangible support we can. A special big thank you to the Lord Mayor for running this whole series and particularly putting two fine people like this in front of us today. The whole year has been great, and I think this is a great exemplar of it. To our friends at ZN for producing the series, and well done for almost keeping up. There's a man called Lucas in the background who is desperately trying to push the buttons. We could see what was happening our end. Sarah and Rosie. I know it was frustrating for you, but we got it, and I know you wanted a particular thing with the bomb bit going off, and that definitely came across. So I think that's where the word "stark" came into my head. And of course, always to the audience that giving up time to come and tune in and listen to these. So once again, a very big thank you to everybody, and really just to wish you all a quiet and, in this country, peaceful rest of our week, and thoughts and prayers go out to everyone in Gaza, Palestine, and elsewhere under conflict. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.